I've already mentioned John Kinsella, who I think is excellent, and his partner Tracy as well, who I think is fantastic. Other Australian writers, I'd probably say more music comes from Australia. I really like Bon Scott's lyrics. I think his lyrics are very simple and almost folk-like in their simplicity and purity of meaning, which I think probably gets lost a lot of the time. I would probably focus more on the interior problems of my own personal experience with the craft of poetry, rather than the exterior kind of push for greater awareness of poetry. In terms of media, I think that poetry has greater kind of influences that are a lot more subtle on art these days. I mean, a lot of TV shows and a lot of movies these days look at film, and they say a lot of film and actors will say we couldn't have done it without the writers, and I think that's true. Even though a lot of, in theatres there's still a lot of influence from poetry in theatre, but I also think that in the built world as well, in a lot of architectural theory, the idea of being poetic is still very integral to that craft and that profession, and that in order for any student or professional to attempt to be poetic in that, they need to look at what poetry is and how those forms might influence their work. So I personally think that just what I started with, the influence of poetry a lot more kind of pervasive and subtle than say television or film. But who cares really? Just do what you think you should be doing with your art. When I first started taking the craft of poetry seriously, and what I mean by that is that what T.S. Eliot would say, to be a really truly great poet, you need to practice in the same way that a pianist or a violinist would practice every day. And John Forbes, in my earlier kind of juvenilia of poetry, I suppose, was an idol of mine. I probably read him every day for 2 years, carting his book around in my bag and pulling it out and reading it at parties and whatever. But I've kind of haven't read him for a while now and moved on to other poets. So back then his stylistic influence was greater than it would be now, but in terms of the journey of my journey with poetry, it's very integral. But I think that overall his belief in his poetry was a religion to him, and I think that's one of his greatest long-lasting influences. I think about it all the time, but whether I write every day or not is a different issue. Half the time it's not what you write in the first place, it's what you rewrite and how you edit it, I find. Because generally I think that, and I can assume that a lot of other people feel the same way, that while you're writing and when you finish writing something, you probably don't think it's very good. And then you return to it 12 months later, and what you thought was good at the time is probably not as good as what you thought was bad at the time. So in terms of practice and on a diurnal basis, I think most of it is out of our kind of control in a way, and we just need to keep plugging at it, and it's only kind of retrospect that we get a clear vision. There's a kind of chronology to this collection, I suppose, and the first two sections are probably, like I said before, the juvenilia of working out poetry. There's a lot of poems in there that are probably more experiments than finding a voice, and being influenced by people like John Forbes, John Kinsella, T.S. Eliot, and other writers. And then towards the end, where we begin with Lead Up Lethargy, and then towards the final poem, it's a bit more allegorical. which deals with the suicide and death of my brother, which happened just over 3 years ago. At that time, I basically stopped reading any other poets at all, and didn't feel like writing whatsoever. And then emerged out of that, and then continued, and then became back to poetry, I suppose, and edited those poems. I probably, like I say before, walked and moved through landscapes, and any catharsis comes through that. And then, as an indirect result of that, the distillation of thought, which comes through to the poetry. The hesitation of the sharing of that was surely a factor, and it still is now. It even makes me nervous right now to even think about sharing some of those still, or reading them out loud. So yeah, they are brutal, and they're as raw and as clean as possible. Possibly even too private. But, that's the way it goes.